The Spider-Man series is one of the largest, most well-known franchises out there, spanning through multiple live-action and animated movies, as well as with a number of spin-off shows and games to go along with them. Even though I consider myself a fan of Spider-Man now, I didn't actually grow up with the series like most fans out there. In fact, up until a few years ago, I knew next to nothing about it. All of this changed though in 2018 with the release of Into the Spider-Verse. This movie series has and will probably continue to be one of my absolute favorites, and it was these films specifically that made me realize, hey, you know what? Spider-Man is actually kind of cool. I slowly grew to love it more over time, and he became my favorite superhero in the MCU.
Mr. Stark, it smells like a new car in here!
But to be honest, I kind of felt like a fake fan. I mean, could I really call myself an unhinged fan of the franchise if I knew next to nothing about it other than a handful of facts? I didn't understand a lot of references or callbacks to the originals, and when I watched the crossover, I didn't feel the same excitement as the rest of the audience, because I just didn't recognize anything. I wasn't really appreciating my so-called favorite superhero, and that needed a change. I decided that if I was going to be deeply obsessed with something, I was going to commit to it, and so I did. I forced my friend to hand over her Disney Plus account, and I binge-watched the entire live-action Spider-Man series, from start to finish. From the very first one released over a decade ago, to the most recent crossover of 2021. I looked at all 8 of these films and made sure to take extensive notes. Probably a little too many notes, and I set out to make a video giving my thoughts on the 3 live-action versions of Spider-Man. I'll be doing a mini little deep dive into all 3 of them, and I'll be breaking down, or more realistically overanalyzing, the different aspects of each series. So things like the main characters, the villains, the story itself, and anything that stood out to me or things that I'll be talking about. While I am going to be going over the movies and critiquing a few things here and there, what I mainly want to do is just take the time to sort of appreciate the movies for what they have to offer. Each of these films has their own little charms that make them unique, so I didn't think it would be fair for me to just say that one was better than the other and ignore everything else that was so great about the rest. That, and I'm pretty sure that if I ranked any of these movies in any way, shape, or form, the original Spider-Man fans might, I don't know, dox me or something. It just wasn't really a risk that I was willing to take. Before I get into the video, I should go ahead and clarify something that the title probably explains, but as the lovely title says, I am in no way a reliable critic. I'm mostly just doing this for fun, and I have absolutely no qualifications to actually review movies, so feel free to take anything that I say with a grain of salt. Also, this video is going to contain every single Spider-Man spoiler under the sun, so if you don't want to get anything spoiled, then I would recommend that you watch the movies for yourself if you have access to them. Just come back to this video afterwards. With all of that being said though, sit back, grab a quick snack, and enjoy the review. While the very first origins of Spider-Man date all the way back to his first comic book appearance in 1962, his story has carried on for over 60 years through the movies, and that brings us to our very first one. The first Spider-Man, as you might already know, was released in 2002, which was, hold on, let me do the math real quick. A really long time ago. The wonderful Tobey Maguire has the honor of starting off the legacy.
You'll get your rent when you fix this damn door!
Peter Parker is a high school student who, oddly enough, is played by a 30-year-old man, which I won't really fault the movie that much for because, to be fair, pretty much every show or movie out there that takes place in high school usually has a cast full of mortgage-paying adults, so it's not like this is the first time we've seen this. By now, we all know the basic premises of these movies. We follow a guy named Peter Parker who lives with his Aunt May and Uncle Ben, and lives a generally happy life. Aww, what a sweet family. I sure hope nothing bad happens to them. He's a little bit awkward and nerdy, and he excels at science, and in most, but not all installations, he's also pretty good at photography. He gets bitten by a radioactive spider, it gives him 20/20 vision, and most importantly, it gives him the ability to do everything that a spider does, with a little added bonus of being able to sense danger before it happens. Pretty neat, pretty cool, it's been said and done, so I won't dwell too much on that. What I will focus on right now, though, is the characters. Arguably one of the most important aspects in a story. If you've seen my previous video, then you'll know that I foam at the mouth for a story if it has great characters, and at least to me, characters can really make or break a movie. So how does the 2002 movie do when it comes to this category? I'm gonna be a little bit honest, Peter 1, as I'll call him, isn't my personal favorite, but there are some things that I liked about it. For starters, he was the original. He was the very first character that set the path for the future ones, and he served as a great blueprint. As that one saying goes, this Peter walked so that the rest of them could run, or at the very least do a light jog, depending on if you like the newer ones or not. Out of all the Spider-Man that I've seen, I would say that this Peter definitely leans more on the realistic side. The first Spider-Man movie was, of course, an adaptation of the comic books that came before it. Through my limited research that mostly consisted of me skimming through a couple of Wikipedia pages, I was able to get a good sense of who the very first Peter Parker was. One of the reasons that his story got so popular in the first place was because of his relatability. He stood out because he really was just an ordinary person, much like the reader. He wasn't like most comic book heroes who, in his time, were these strong and stoic characters who dedicated themselves to protecting others with an unbreakable will. He definitely shares a couple of those traits here and there, but at the end of the day, he could just as easily blend into a crowd once his mask came off. He wasn't an alien from another planet or someone born with supernatural powers, he was just an average guy. Both the comics and the movies prove this point to us time and time again by showing us how normal he is. There are these amazing moments where he defeats villains and comes out on top, but there are also moments where he falters and doubts his own abilities. We see him struggle to pay rent while he lives paycheck to paycheck or crumble under the pressure of having so many responsibilities. There's this one scene that I absolutely love in the first movie where Peter gets the inspiration to create a suit when he discovers his powers, and it builds up your expectations on what he's going to reveal to us, but the actual end result is this, which is just such a perfect way to ground him into reality. I mean, of course he isn't going to create a flawless suit on his first try. The dude's only skills consist of being good at science and standing there awkwardly. It's not like he was going to suddenly make a perfect suit. Of course, as the movies continue to go on, he does improve a lot more. He learns how to navigate the world with his new powers, he learns how to balance the two sides of his life, and he slowly grows into becoming a great superhero. Even though we see him continue to develop and defeat all these villains over and over again, at the end of the day, he takes off his mask and he's still a normal person. And I absolutely love that about him. Alright, so now that I've showered Peter 1 with enough compliments, it's time to tear him to shreds. Okay, well, not really, but there are things that I didn't really like about this specific series. I honestly don't really have too many problems with the movie itself. For the most part, I can see why it appeals to fans, and while it has been growing on me over time, my biggest issue has and always will be how they mishandled the character of MJ. Mary Jane was a character that I was really excited to see portrayed on screen. I had seen both Spider-Man Far From Home and No Way Home a couple of years prior to working on this, and in those ones, MJ was my favorite character, so I really wanted to see what the original had been like. I had pretty high hopes, and I wanted to like her. I really did, but I just couldn't. Mary Jane had a pretty interesting setup. She was someone who was very well known in her inner circle as this happy and carefree girl who always had a smile on her face. People were naturally attracted to her charm. As we quickly find out though, this charisma is at times more of an act. It's sort of like a mask that she puts on to hide the struggles that are weighing her down in her life. Toward the beginning of the first movie, there's a scene that takes place the day after Peter overhears MJ having a heated argument with her dad. Peter walks behind her on the street, and while Peter is busy mumbling to himself and struggling to form coherent sentences, we see her slump over and start to cry. Seconds later though, her friends drive up to her, and the second they approach, MJ is immediately back to being that carefree person. It's almost as if her short moment of vulnerability never even happened in the first place. This is one of the only few scenes that shows us that there's more depth to her, and it's mostly all that we get. Immediately after this, MJ is reduced to being nothing more than a love interest and a bargaining chip. Here's the thing, I love a good romantic subplot. I mean, I eat that stuff up for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Do you know how many rom-coms I've seen? Far too many, probably. If a romance is done right, I'm all for it. But this is not the case with the original Spider-Man. If you're gonna have a love interest, give them something outside of that. People exist outside of their relationships. Their lives do not revolve around a single person. The same rules apply in storytelling. For the most part, MJ's screen time revolves solely around Peter. Let's use Harry as an example of a character who does not have this issue. A major part of Harry's story and his eventual downfall revolves around his friendship with Peter. We get to slowly watch their once strong relationship fall apart, and their bitterness quickly turns into a deadly rivalry by the end of the series. Both Peter and Harry are bound together by the plot, but Harry is still shown to exist outside of the friendship. He has his own character arcs and struggles that revolve around him and no one else. This is not the case with MJ. We know things about her, like her biggest dream is to become an actress because she tells us directly, or the fact that she has a bad relationship with her family because it's shown to us. But for the most part, these are all surface level things. The movie doesn't spend proper time to allow us to get to know her on a more personal level. Now, there is a small exception to this. During the very last movie, Mary Jane does end up getting her own side plot, and it does help give her more depth. After finally achieving her dream of becoming an actress, a series of negative reviews sends her career into a spiral. She begins to doubt if she ever even had any talent to begin with.
Look at these words. It's like my father wrote them.
I missed the part where that's my problem.
This was a really interesting side plot, and it gave us more time to focus on MJ as a character instead of just her relation to the main character. It created a perfect opportunity for her to grow and develop as a person, and she would be able to learn to find her own self-worth in a career that she was constantly being critiqued in. So where does the movie go from here? What happens to MJ once this problem arises? Well, a few scenes later, MJ gets kidnapped by the villains once again and is held as a bargaining chip. This being the fifth time that this has happened? MJ is such an important character who makes appearances throughout multiple different stories under the Spider-Man name, but in this one, it feels like they're just constantly forcing her into this little box where she isn't allowed to be anything other than a love interest who constantly gets held for ransom to create drama. The second she was finally given more substance, she was once again reduced to being a damsel in distress. And look, I'm not saying that a love interest should never have to be rescued or that they should be completely untouchable. The love interests in the other versions of Spider-Man all, at some point, need to be saved, and I have no problem with this. Every character, regardless of the role that they play, needs help from time to time. It shows us that they aren't invincible. So my issue isn't with the fact that Mary Jane needs to be saved, it's that it's her only purpose. The movie only needs her so that the main character can save her and, in turn, show the audience how courageous and selfless he is. They use it as a way to motivate him, and that would be fine if it wasn't done so excessively. In the other movies, there are times where the love interests do need to be saved, and they're usually pretty good scenes that help add more tension to an already dire situation. However, the newer ones do it tastefully, because they use them sparingly. Not only that, but they actually allow these characters to have their own lives outside of Peter's. In those ones, they are much more important to the plot, outside of just adding drama and tension. They contribute to the story and are often progressing through the story alongside the main character. They serve a much bigger purpose outside of just their roles. With the original though, this happens so often to MJ that it really feels as if it's her only purpose for being in the movie. Mary Jane's sole existence in these movies is to be an accessory to the main character. She's the love interest that he yearns for. She's a damsel in distress that he saves in order to prove his bravery. She is the girl who falls for him and loses her own sense of self in the process. Mary Jane is a character with so much wasted potential. I truly wish there was more that I could say about her, but unfortunately there just isn't. And that's disappointing. You could say that the movie was just simply a product of its time and that I shouldn't be getting so worked up about a movie that was made so long ago, but it's important to point out how damaging this trope can be, for a number of reasons, but also just because it can ruin the quality of a movie. MJ might not have had as much substance as I would have wanted her to, but there are other characters that I could continue to analyze a bit more. For starters, you can't really talk about MJ and Peter without mentioning their other friend, who is an essential part of the movie, Harry Osborn.
I have nothing left except Spider-Man.
Harry is interesting, mainly because I felt that this man was the definition of a toxic friend, and I was all here for it. The movie makes it clear that Peter and Harry have been friends for years, and while they're supposed to be close, Harry kind of treats him like garbage half the time. In the first 20 minutes of the first movie, Peter and Harry are talking, and he mentions that he has a crush on their classmate MJ. And what does Harry do as a response? He walks right over to her and flirts with her.
Do you know that this is the largest electron microscope?
And he's just constantly making these little jabs at his friend. Then there's also the whole part about him trying to murder his own best friend, but that's not as important. It feels like half the time their friendship just consists of Harry trying to put Peter down, and you know what? It makes perfect sense. Harry Osborn is, as you might know, the son of Norman Osborn, a wealthy scientist who runs a very successful tech corporation named Oscorp.
I'm something of a scientist myself.
It's interesting because the first time that Harry's dad meets Peter, he greets him with admiration and praise over his outstanding skills in science, all while his own son watches from the sidelines. A pretty normal interaction, a nice one you might even say, but it's Harry's sarcastic comment right afterwards that gives us a glimpse of what's really going on.
It doesn't seem so bad.
Yeah, not if you're a genius. I think he wants to adopt you.
Where Peter excels in science, Harry does not. Harry isn't like his father and his best friend because he doesn't have that natural calling towards the world of, periodic tables and Bunsen burners or something. We're even told pretty early on in his introduction that Harry has failed out of multiple private schools in the past, which could either be a form of rebellion against his dad's high standards or a result of sheer burnout. It's made clear through multiple examples that Harry and his dad don't really get along. Norman has created these high expectations for his son, who is put under constant pressure. He's a part of an important family, so becoming a quote-unquote failure would ruin them. It's a good setup for a villain in of itself, but they make it even better by having his villain arc follow the footsteps of his father's, which is, ironically, exactly what Harry was trying to avoid in the first place. The Green Goblin is easily one of the most compelling villains in the entire Spider-Man series. Norman Osborn started off as any other villain usually does, a normal-ish guy whose ambitions took him one step too far. But what I absolutely loved about this villain was the fact that he didn't even know he was a villain. He spends half of the movie confused while he slowly puts together the scattered puzzle pieces of his reality until everything clicks. The Green Goblin, as I'm guessing you probably know, is an alter ego of sorts. He lives inside of Norman's mind and takes over his body to commit a bunch of crimes in his funny green suit, while Norman himself has no idea that this is happening. Even though they try to sort of keep the Green Goblin's true identity a secret at the start, it's pretty clear to the audience who it is. I mean, who could it be, really? Some New York citizen or a crazy scientist who we saw get sprayed by mysterious green gas? The mystery itself doesn't really matter. The tension isn't built around the reveal. It's built around Norman's slow descent into madness. At first, we watch him as he begins to notice all of these inconsistencies in his life, things that just don't really add up. He finds himself randomly waking up in places he wasn't before, or looking beaten up but having no prior memory of what actually happened. Then, of course, comes a voice that starts to haunt him. It becomes much harder as the movies go on to tell when we're seeing Norman and when we're seeing the Green Goblin. Eventually, he succumbs to it entirely. William Dafoe absolutely ate this role up, by the way. From his iconic creepy grin to his performances that made you feel Norman's desperation as he fought against his own mind, it was all just amazing. There's this one specific scene, the mirror scene, that I absolutely loved. It's the first time Norman gets to confront his other self by speaking directly into a mirror. This second voice is incredibly aggressive as it degrades Norman, forcing him to come face to face with the criminal that he has become. Most of the back and forth talking between these two separate beings is shown with separate shots of both Norman and the mirror, to highlight who was currently speaking. Even though it's filmed in a way that helps us get the idea that these are two different people talking, at the very beginning of their conversation, there's a brief moment where you can fully see both Norman and his reflection at the same time. Even though our focus is mainly drawn to the mirror, you can still see a bit of Norman's mouth moving, while the Green Goblin is talking through the reflection, which only serves to drive even further the fact that this is all taking place in one single broken mind. Norman is completely by himself. What we're seeing is nothing more than a conversation that's taking place in someone's head. It's not something that's supernatural. The mirror's reflection isn't moving by itself, it's mimicking reality. This isn't something that can simply go away, it's been permanently embedded into his mind. It's here to stay, and that's terrifying. The tragic part about the Green Goblin is that after a certain point, you can't really tell if the original Norman is even there anymore. He could have simply given into his other self entirely, or maybe there's still a chance that his real personality is still hidden somewhere inside, somewhere far out of reach where he's being forced to watch the chaos unfold while he is unable to do a single thing about it. After Green Goblin does eventually get demolished by Spider-Man, his son, who had once been so reluctant to follow in his footsteps, takes over. Harry becomes convinced that Spider-Man killed his dad, which, I mean, yeah, he kinda did, and Harry begins to obsess over finding out Spider-Man's true identity. It's this obsession that begins his own villain arc. Eventually, he does discover that his favorite punching bag Peter is the one behind the mask. It's soon after Harry finds out the identity of Spider-Man and Green Goblin that he willingly goes through the same process of becoming the new villain for the sake of revenge. Revenge over the death of his father was one reason that drove him to the point of wanting to see vengeance, but his aggressive attitude towards Peter had been growing long before that. I want to go back to what I previously said about how, at times, Harry's dad seemed to be more fond of Peter than of his own son. Even though Harry constantly tried to distance himself from his dad's high expectations, he still wanted to make his dad proud. Having your own father constantly talk up someone else while you're trying your best to make them proud is bound to create bitter feelings. It's the reason behind Harry's constant remarks against Peter. And while you could argue that this is simply just friendly banter, to a certain extent, I believe that there was some truth to the little jabs he would make against him. From his point of view, it was the only way for him to express the anger that he was feeling at his own father preferring someone else over him. In Harry's eyes, Peter was a constant reminder of everything that he failed to be, a good son who could make his father proud. There was already a lot of anger buried deep inside him, and his grief over his death, as well as the realization that the one person he was supposed to trust had seemingly betrayed him, caused things to finally boil over. His friend was the only person he could take his problems out on. Eventually, though, he does realize that taking his anger out on someone whose only real crime was having the audacity to dance like this in public is probably a little bit unfair. So by the end of the series, he does end up sacrificing himself to save his friends. His dad died a villain, but Harry was able to die a hero, ultimately going against his father's expectations. The Green Goblin may objectively be one of the best villains, but one of my personal favorites was Octavius. Unfortunately though, he doesn't last longer than the 90-minute runtime of this movie, as he gets annihilated at the end of the second movie and doesn't come back for another 20 years. I kind of feel bad for this guy because he pretty much had it all before he became a villain. He was this really cool scientist with lots of potential, but again, just like the previous one I mentioned, his ambitions got the best of him. He could have turned back at any moment, but it was this refusal to call it quits during an experiment that led to the death of his wife and to his mind being taken over by his own creation. The arms he created, which were made to handle dangerous material safely, ended up becoming the real villains, who were only using Otto as a sort of vessel for their chaos. They may be a part of him, but the movie makes it clear that their sole survival is their top priority. Since Otto's failsafe to prevent the arms from controlling his brain gets destroyed in the explosion, they begin to influence his mind. These arms are kind of terrifying when you really think about it. They're the ones that are really pulling the strings, and the way that they move around menacingly every so often, or even threaten Otto every now and then, is eerie. By the time the arms do take over, he no longer really has anything to live for, or more specifically, anything to hold him back. So not only is this guy walking around with these terrifying stainless steel tongs behind him, but he goes around harming anyone and anything that gets in his way because there's nothing stopping him. At the end of the movie, when he finally realizes that he's been manipulated, he chooses to sacrifice himself to once and for all end the mess that he started. He knows that he can't get rid of these arms that have power over him, but in a way he can, at the very least, control his own destiny. Alright, so next on the list we've got Sandman. For some reason, the only thing that I have written down about Sandman in my notes is that he looks like the dude from Blue's Clues in his green sweater. What I liked about Sandman is that he was just the most casual and uncaring villains in the series. I think he's basically the perfect definition of chaotic neutral. He has his goals, he has his interests, and while he doesn't go out of his way to hunt down innocent people, he's willing to do what he needs to do to get things done. He's also one of the only villains that doesn't get a definitive ending. Most, if pretty much not all of the villains in the series, either die or get put in some sort of prison. Sandman, though, he just walks off when the fight is over. We don't really get a concrete conclusion on him. The only reason he fought against Spider-Man was for the sake of his daughter, who we never really see again after her first appearance. We don't really get to know what happens to them afterwards or if he's able to go back to her. But I guess it is also pretty realistic. Not all endings can be wrapped up in a nice little bow and be concluded neatly. It's the perfect ambiguous ending to the most morally ambiguous villain. Okay, so the last one on the list is the Venom goop thing, which is technically two people. First, there's the random dude that it takes over for like a couple seconds, who I don't really care too much about. And then there's the Venom version of Spider-Man. I am 1000% sure that there are more like accurate names to give these villains, and I probably sound really dumb right now, but I'm just gonna call them that for now. The third movie in the series is probably the best one, and most of it is about Peter turning emo because he gets taken over by this random black stuff that falls from space. Peter just becomes more chaotic as the movie goes on, and watching his personality gradually change was really entertaining. It was like we had an entirely different character who just lived off of chaos and being a menace to society. I mean, so many of these scenes are just genuinely hilarious. They were kind of goofy, but at the same time, the movie knew that they were, and they just fully dived into the unseriousness of his montage. He kind of knew that it was changing his personality, but he just let it happen because of the adrenaline boost that he got from it. Of course, it also served as a good metaphor for revenge as he starts going after the people who have wronged him. And like I mentioned before, there's the little last minute surprise villain that we get, the random dude I mentioned earlier. He did serve as a great reminder that all of Peter's actions have consequences. During the height of Peter's emo alter ego phase, he finds out that this guy named Eddie was not only coming after his position as a photographer at the Daily Bugle, the only place he can really make a stable income, but he had even gone as far as to Photoshop an image of Spider-Man to paint him in a bad light. He proceeds to absolutely demolish Eddie socially and embarrasses him by revealing that the photo is fake. And even though this is something seemingly insignificant, it's actually Eddie who comes back at the last minute seeking revenge. His villain arc comes out of nowhere as we're too distracted by everything else going on in the plot to expect him. I loved the final fight scene where Peter figures out that Venom's one and only weakness is sound. He manages to trap Eddie around a bunch of bars of steel and bangs them repeatedly, causing the once invincible threat to just get folded like a lawn chair in seconds. I think it's pretty safe to say that the original easily has one of the best overall villains. Here, they're treated as important side characters. We get to see their origins as well as how their paths unfold, which made for really compelling storylines. The first movie mainly focuses on introducing the story and characters to the audience. We follow Peter as he grows into his new powers and learns how to become a superhero, and that's mainly what the theme follows. I just covered the ideas of the final movie, you know, the whole revenge bad thing, but the ideas of the second movie are ones that I really liked. In the second movie, he gets into college, and not only is he a STEM major, which is already hard enough to deal with, but he still has to continue being Spider-Man in a city that is seemingly always in danger. The worst part about all of this is that since his identity is a secret, he never really gets the credit he deserves. He sacrifices everything for the city, but in his regular life, he gets called unreliable and unwanted by employers, or gets bullied by his classmates who clearly peaked in high school. Really, it's no wonder why he gives up being Spider-Man halfway through the film. All of his responsibilities begin to weigh down on him, and he starts losing focus. Even his ability to use his webs goes away due to the stress he's facing. Towards the end of the movie, he of course goes back to being Spider-Man, but not before taking a long break to compose himself. It's a pretty realistic and universal storyline, and by the end of it, he learns that he has to, what's that thing boomers say? Pick himself up by the bootstraps and find a way to balance everything in his life. Okay, that actually sounds kind of rude, but what I mean to say is that the message reminds us that we're gonna face countless obstacles in our daily lives. It's pretty much inevitable, but each time we have to learn how to get through them, even if it means taking some time off to focus on what we really need. Being Spider-Man was never a choice, it was a responsibility that was given to him by chance, and he can never truly separate it from himself completely. And while that definitely comes with its drawbacks, he learns how to balance everything and finds that there are still aspects of being Spider-Man that make everything worth it. The themes in this version were grounded in reality. There are things that can be seen in the lives of average people, which just adds to the relatability of this character. I went into the series not really knowing what to expect, but I was able to see why these movies are so well loved. They're fun, and they have this nostalgic, original charm to them that makes them so appealing. It popularized a lot of the characters that we know now, and it's not 100% for me, but I'm really glad that, despite its age, it's still being admired to this day. I think the general consensus when it comes to the second series is that it's a great adaptation that's well loved by a lot of the fans. One of the first things that you'll notice about this movie compared to the previous one is that it feels more like an action movie. At times, it sort of has a heavier and more serious atmosphere. For instance, Spider-Man acts as more of a vigilante at the start, and in the background of the main conflict, you've got this whole plot about the mystery surrounding the death of his parents and the origins of the spider that ended up biting him. Even though they had to fit a lot of plot points into one movie, I really liked how they put in the extra effort to expand the lore, even if it did kind of end up going against provides the most important theme of the original. We, of course, follow another Peter Parker, Peter 2 if you will, played by the lovely Andrew Garfield.
For sure.
He's a little bit different from the one we've grown used to, but he's still as socially awkward as ever and is also into science and photography. In this one though, he's a lot bolder, even standing up for himself and others multiple times, and oddly enough, he doesn't really seem to care too much that he's an outsider, at least not on the surface. To my surprise, I ended up really loving this main character. He's a lot more sarcastic and witty here, and I feel like he really captured a more dry humored side of Peter, which gave us some really great comedic scenes to balance out the serious atmosphere. He also felt a little more angsty, if that makes any sense. But of course, he was still equally as adorably awkward at times, so while he isn't exactly the same as the one that we've seen before, it never felt like he was straying too far from the original. Overall, he just felt very dynamic, which was definitely one of his strengths. He could go from being this shy kid in his class to a vigilante who acted with so much confidence. It made him feel very three-dimensional and easy to root for. He never took himself too seriously when he was fighting, offering up sarcastic remarks every now and then to remind us that deep down, he's still just an ordinary person. I loved his overall personality, and he was a great main character who kept you hooked into the story while also just offering some well-needed comedic relief. Of course, Peter didn't carry the movie by himself because that came from none other than Gwen Stacy. These two were the main leading characters in both of the Amazing Spider-Man movies, and I honestly don't think they could have cast a better pair. Their dynamic felt so real and natural that even though the romance was a little bit rushed at the start, it never really bothered me because they felt like a real couple. There was never a moment where they were both on screen that I ever felt bored. If anything, these two helped make the movie that much more entertaining. When they weren't too busy with their back and forth banter, they were helping each other progress through the story together. Gwen herself is just such an amazing character. She had such a strong, charismatic personality that it was basically impossible to not like her. Gwen never once felt as if she was just a side character, or just Peter's partner, but like someone who was equally as important. The dynamic between these two leads was something that the others just can't really compare to. From their flawless teamwork to their back and forth conversations, they had this chemistry that made them feel as if they were an actual couple who not only cared about each other, but understood each other.
What's your name?
You don't know my name?
No, I know your name. I just want to know if you know your name.
You want to see them together. You want to see how they face all of these challenges as a duo, and you can feel a genuine connection between these two in a way that is just so unmatched. It's this deep connection that makes Gwen Stacy's death so heartbreaking. Peter knew from the start that letting Gwen into his life and into his work would mean constantly putting her at risk. This was something that she was more than willing to do, but it was after he failed to save Gwen's dad that he chose to distance himself because he thought it was the right thing to do. In his mind, as long as she wasn't in his life, the people that were out to get him wouldn't be able to get her. Unfortunately, he was right. The worst part about what happened to Gwen was that technically, it wasn't one of Peter's enemies that ended things once and for all, but Peter himself. It's hard to watch the clock tower scene without getting, at the very least, a little bit emotional. Not just because of the incredible acting, but because we're seeing Peter realize that he not only lost everything, but that it could have been avoided if he had just stuck to his original plan. As the viewer, we know that it's not fair to blame Peter for Gwen's fall. As hard as he may try, he can never save everyone. There's no guarantee that every person he comes across will live. It's pretty much inevitable, but it's so easy for him to blame himself for the tragedy, which is exactly what he does. This is how it ends for the both of them. After this, there are no more movies that continue his story or show us how he was able to pick himself up after what happened. This event gives the series a permanently somber feeling. Since this series was released years after the first ones, it had the benefit of being produced when CGI and effects had improved, so the action scenes and the effects are both really great in this one. It also really helped make both Peter and the villain's powers seem more grounded in reality. For instance, the spider that bites him not only comes from a lab, but we were shown the inside of the lab that created it. The technology felt believable enough so that it seemed as if it could realistically happen. And the same goes for the villains. Their origins felt somewhat grounded in reality. I mean, except for this movie's version of Green Goblin, he felt a little bit more fantastical, but I'll get to that in just a bit. The first villain in the series is a lizard with human lips. I hated looking at this thing because it's clearly not human, but it still has like human features, so it just looked like a horrifyingly uncanny creature. The lizard wasn't always a lizard. He used to be a scientist named Kurt Connors. Connors wasn't my personal favorite, but he was the first one that we were introduced to, so you know, he did his job, he did his thing. I don't have anything super noteworthy to say about him, but I did like him as a character and I thought his motives were really interesting. The one that came after him though has to be one of the best to come out of the series, and that's Electro. Electro, whose real name is Max, had a story that mirrored the main characters. He was an ordinary person who was unliked by many around him, and just like Peter, he was accidentally given these amazing powers, although Max's were given to him because of pure negligence. They both ended up with these incredible abilities, but the difference was that people reacted to Electro with fear. He had no one to support him, there was no one he could turn to. Even his own hero, Spider-Man, seemingly ends up betraying him, at least in Max's eyes. Max was a character that you couldn't help but pity. You felt for his mistreatment and his loneliness, and that makes seeing him turn into the biggest threat in the movie that much more compelling. annoying. When you really think about it, this could have been the route that Peter went down if he had had different circumstances. The first fight between Electro and Spider-Man was one of the best scenes in the movie. Watching Electro slowly lose his composure until he finally snaps, all while hearing his inner thoughts out loud in this terrifying chant, made the scene that much more intense, and the music that accompanied it fit the atmosphere perfectly by adding an extra layer of tension. Once Electro does decide that everyone around him is stinky and that he should become a villain instead, he teams up with someone else. Remember Harry Osborn from the previous movie? He comes back for this one too, although his story has been changed to fit the new narrative. He's even got an atrocious haircut in this version. Just like the previous one, Peter and Harry were best friends up until Harry moved away. Even though they end up reconnecting, you can always get the sense that there's some sort of rift between them that can never be fully fixed. By the time that they do re-meet, their friendship was already being held up by a very thin string, so Harry's betrayal doesn't come out of nowhere, it feels like a natural continuation. He always had a mysterious and slightly unnerving atmosphere around him. They focused less on the friendship and more on his own individual character arc that eventually coincides with the main characters. We find out in the second movie that Harry's dad has a mysterious and incurable disease that has been slowly killing him for years, and it's genetic, meaning that our beloved buddy Harry will also develop the same disease and has essentially been bound to die a lonely and honestly kind of horrific death, just like his estranged father. This character, who we almost always see with eerily perfect composure, begins to slowly lose his sanity as the sickness begins to deteriorate his own health. He becomes desperate, lashing out at anyone he can and acting increasingly more unhinged as time goes on, but you can't help but sympathize with him. It's no wonder why his desperation takes him to drastic measures. Since Harry's back in this movie, Oscorp is too, and I think by now we can all just officially agree to never trust Oscorp in any way, shape, or form. Oscorp does end up having a pretty big involvement in the plot, so I do kind of have to go on a bit of an info dump tangent here. So I apologize if you're already caught up with the lore, but don't worry, I'll try to make it interesting. Here, I'll even put a video of me playing Subway Surfers on the screen so that you don't lose interest too quickly. Alright, so basically, Peter's dad had been making some kind of weird genetic project or something with Oscorp. I don't know, I didn't pay attention. Again, this is an unreliable review. Anyway, Oscorp wanted to use this for evil, but Peter's dad was like, no. So I think he destroyed all of his information or something along those lines so that Oscorp wouldn't be able to use it. As it turns out, Peter's dad's blood was put into the spiders. Since his dad's blood was in their genetics, Peter was able to gain these powers and become Spider-Man after getting bitten. So Harry's dad dies in the first couple of minutes in the movie due to the illness that I mentioned before, and he ominously warns his son about his own unavoidable fate. As Harry's own health begins to take a turn for the worse, he grows desperate and somehow comes to the conclusion that injecting himself with Spider-Man's blood will cure him. Peter refuses to go through with this since he suspects that it could go terribly wrong. So Harry teams up with Electro, and together they sneak into an Oscorp bunker to retrieve the venom themselves. This, of course, ends up going horribly wrong, and in a scene that is honestly a bit horrific with the effects and lighting, he transforms into the Green Goblin. This is where the movie loses me a little bit. Like I've said before, everything here is based off of science fiction. Everything is, to an extent, believable, but Harry's transformation feels so out of place, almost fantastical. His appearance and voice changes seemingly out of nowhere, which is strange because this never happened to Peter. Harry, though, just completely transforms for no reason. He low-key looks like a leprechaun. He looks like he's about to try and sell me some cereal. Harry goes from being creepy and intimidating to just weird looking, and it's hard to take him seriously when he's talking in a goofy voice. He can't compare to the original, but I will say that I liked his characterization and overall arc. It's clear to see that this version was a lot more plot heavy and felt like an action movie, and while I really did appreciate that and I found it more engaging, I did have a bit of an issue with the whole spider lore thing. So as I've said before, both Peter and Harry were injected with the same venom, but one of them got turned into a hero and the other got turned into whatever that thing is. From my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, but just do it politely or I will start crying, the only reason Peter was able to get a more positive effect from being bitten was because the spider technically had his dad's genetics in them, meaning that no one else could have become Spider-Man, only him. So it kind of defeats the purpose of Spider-Man being a very relatable and ordinary hero. Even though it was just a coincidence and Peter's dad never planned or set any of this up to happen, it does kind of remind me of the Chosen One trope. The Chosen One trope is something that a lot of people, including myself, don't really like. It defeats the purpose of working hard towards a goal since everything is already predetermined. So not only was Peter sort of a chosen one in this case, but he was also just kind of automatically good at being Spider-Man. This is very different from the other versions of Spider-Man out there, who all struggle with their new powers at first, and it isn't until they undergo lots of trial and error and hours of hard work that they eventually grow into their roles. I love this version of Peter, don't get me wrong. He's definitely one of my personal favorites, but these things take away from the whole point of who he was supposed to be in the first place. He just kind of woke up one day, got bitten, and was already a pro at what he was doing. Regardless of all of that though, the Amazing Spider-Man series continues to be pretty well received by the fans, and I think a lot of fans can agree that it was a good adaptation. So why wasn't it finished? As you probably already know, there are only 2 movies in this installment, and it kind of ends on a cliffhanger. The cancellation could be due to a number number of reasons, ranging from the low amount of money that the second movie made compared to the first one, or even to the originals, to them simply not being able to figure out where exactly they wanted the series to go. It could be a combination of so many different factors, but from what I was sort of able to figure out, it was ultimately decided that the series would be scrapped and rebooted as a part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Despite the fact that I really do like the newest version, it's sad to see such a great movie go without a proper conclusion, although this newer one does offer up some sort of closure. Our current Spider-Man is played by none other than our favorite British baddie, Tom Holland. He stands out from the rest of the group because he not only has his very own Disney attraction that works 100% of the time, but because he's a part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or the MCU. Before Spider-Man had been reintroduced to the world, the Marvel Cinematic Universe was already a very well-known and loved cinematic series. This created the perfect opportunity to bring Spider-Man back into the light. This Spider-Man had the benefit of already being a well-known hero due to the comics and the past movies, and being added to the MCU during its peak would only guarantee that it would be well received. Peter 3, as I'll call him, first made his appearance not in his very own movie, but in the movie Captain America Civil War, which was a crossover itself and featured a bunch of popular Marvel characters. It's a movie that I can pretty much tell you nothing about. I honestly just skipped to the parts that Peter was in for the sake of making this video, since I felt that getting up to date on the entire MCU lore would take a very long time, so it was probably a good movie, but I really have no clue. This newer version of Spider-Man takes a different approach to a story. For one thing, they don't start from the very beginning like the others do. They don't show us his origins or delve into his backstory, mainly because we already know all of this. By that point, there were already 2 major movie series that covered all of that with more detail, so they purposely skip over all of these repetitive details that we pretty much know by heart at this point, and we officially meet our new Peter Parker when he's already 6 months into his whole Spider-Man thing. Back when I was in early high school and I had pretty much little to no knowledge on anything Marvel, I ended up loving this version of Spider-Man. I think it's because they managed to really pull in their target audience, which I'm assuming was mostly meant to be Gen Z. All of the Peters fall into the same age range. They start off as high schoolers, although the first and second one only remain in high school for the first movie, and are quickly thrown into the adult world by the time their other movie comes up. Peter 3, however, remains in high school even up until his most recent movie where he graduates. The MCU Peter is nerdy and dorky in the best of ways, and he has this air of awkwardness around him that's believable for someone who's meant to be in high school. I remember back when his movies were first coming out that a lot of my classmates really liked him, mainly because he was just so relatable. He felt like he could be someone you realistically went to school with but never really gave much thought to, or maybe you could even see a part of yourself reflected in his personality. He manages to capture the life of an ordinary high schooler perfectly. We see him participate in school activities, go to prom, go on field trips with his peers, and in the midst of all of this, he's also dealing with being a superhero and fighting off multiple threats. The series takes its time with Peter's story, and it doesn't skip around too much time-wise. One of the biggest strengths that came from this decision to take his story step by step was that the audience got to watch him grow. We watch his story slowly unfold as he faces a number of different challenges and obstacles. He's constantly making mistakes, miscalculating his abilities, or doubting himself time and time again, and through all of this, he learns. His character development is progressive, and with each movie we get to see how he falls and eventually gets right back up. He doesn't get better on his own though, he gets quite a bit of help from the lively cast around him. First off, there's Tony Stark, who I've mentioned before. He finds this kid in New York wearing an atrocious looking onesie as a costume with lots of potential, and through his guidance he turns him into one of the strongest superheroes in the MCU, this time with a very cool looking costume. This is more of a side tangent and it's really not that important, but I loved the Spider-Man's costumes the best. The others aren't bad, don't get me wrong. I mean, the first one is a classic, so it'll always have that original charm to it, and the second one makes him look intimidating, but the newer ones just look so cozy, while also looking cool of course. They look comfortable to wear and soft, which is better when you think about it. I mean, if you're gonna be wearing a suit for hours on end, you might as well make it easy to wear. I also really loved how the designs of Peter's costumes in this series were always changing with each movie. It helped us visually see the character's progression with each passing film. Back to the previous tangent though, there was also Aunt May, who acted as a parent to Peter. What the? She was by far my favorite Aunt May. She had the most personality, and her and Peter's relationship felt very caring. And of course, the main character also had endless support from his friends. The trio, which eventually made up the main cast, felt as if they shared a real bond. There's Ned, who finds out about Peter's identity pretty early on in the first movie and remains by his side throughout the entire series. He's always being supportive and helps him out in any way that he can.
Peter knows Spider-Man.
There's also another character that makes up the trio, and of course we can't forget about her. She is my personal favorite character in the entire movie, and in my completely biased opinion, she single-handedly carries the movies. MJ feels a lot different from the previous versions of Mary Jane that we've seen before, not only because of their differing personalities, but because of the fact that she isn't even introduced to us as the love interest in the first place. The first thing you'll notice about this MJ is that her name is different, with the MJ standing for Michelle Jones here instead of the classic Mary Jane. It's a nod to the original, almost like paying it proper respects, while also serving as a subtle way to show show us that this is a newer, original take. For most of the first movie where Michelle makes her initial appearance, she's never introduced to us as an important character. We don't even find out that her nickname is MJ until the last handful of minutes when she says so herself. Before that, she's only referred to as Michelle. What they do instead is that they introduce someone named Liz. On the surface, Liz fits the criteria to be Peter's MJ because she shares a lot of similarities to the ones before her. Like the first Mary Jane, Liz is a well-loved and popular student in her class and is always friendly towards, but never truly notices Peter at the start. And as for the actual MJ, she's just kind of nowhere to be found for the first movie. She's rarely in the film itself and maybe takes up like, what, 10 minutes of screen time? Maybe less? And that's including when she's in the background. She's mostly just off doing her own thing in the first film, and you rarely even see her interacting with Peter outside of a couple of lines and drawn out stares. They spend a lot of time on a character we never see again after the first movie, instead of one who actually ends up being a crucial character. It seems like a weird choice at first, but it actually makes quite a bit of sense, and it's very fitting for the character. MJ is a very introverted and closed-off person who mainly keeps to herself, so it makes sense that she hardly has any speaking roles and is mainly in the background at the start. It's a subversion of what we usually expect from a love interest. We expect them to play a major role from the start, but that simply isn't true in the real world. Once MJ eventually begins to get close to both Peter and Ned, her involvement grows from there and she becomes an essential character. It's funny because both Peter and MJ are characters who seemingly have different personalities. MJ is very sarcastic and she's always very grounded in reality. Meanwhile, Peter is endlessly optimistic and friendly, always giving others the benefit of the doubt to a fault. They were different fundamentally, but it was their contrasting personalities that made them such a great pair. What I loved about this version of MJ was that she just did not care. She was so weirdly unique and didn't care about fitting in whatsoever, and that ended up being one of her biggest strengths.
Can't believe you guys are at this lame party.
You're here too.
Am I?
And even though her sarcastic sense of humor can sometimes make her a bit of an outcast to the rest of the people around her, this never seems to bother her. In fact, she thrives on being independent. Good for her, we love an independent queen, and as a result ends up being one of the most observant and smartest characters in her entire class. She loved being an outcast, she was often blunt and realistic, but she was also kind to everyone around her. And also, she's just hilarious. I mean, sarcastic characters always have a way of winning me over, so she was pretty much bound to be my favorite. This movie establishes a real friend group that cares about each other deeply, and it's one of the things that I really loved about it. They go out of their way to develop the main cast so that you get to know them and, as a result, grow attached to them. It's through this that they make us want to come back and see how their stories continue to unfold. With the main cast out of the way, it's time to talk about the villains. There are only really two in this series, and to be completely honest, the first one was just kind of forgettable. I didn't care much about him, and the only really interesting thing about him was the fact that there was a slight twist in his story. The second one, though, is a lot more interesting, mainly because of his powers, but also just because he was the first one that pushed the main character past his limits. Mysterio is a kind of boring character by himself who gets introduced to us as a hero. He supposedly has a noble backstory, and on the surface appears to be this selfless character who might even serve as a proper role model to the main character after Tony Stark's death. As it turns out though, he's just some guy seeking petty revenge. What's worse is that Peter trusts him fully with the deep grief that he's feeling over Stark's death, and this guy takes full advantage of his vulnerability and kindness and uses it against him. Mysterio lies about his entire backstory and about having superpowers in general, and the only reason he's able to convince everyone of his lies is because he uses these holograms to create very convincing illusions. He may not have any abilities of his own, other than the ability to eat hot chip and lie, but his methods were still terrifying. We quickly find out that the threat doesn't lie with Mysterio himself, but in the fact that you can't even trust what you're seeing on screen to be true. The fight scenes between Mysterio and Spider-Man felt so intense because you never really knew what was going on. It was hard to tell what was an illusion and what wasn't, and the way that he weaponized Peter's grief was brutal.
If you were good enough, maybe Tony would still be alive.
Mysterio took full advantage of someone who was still in the process of dealing with so much guilt, just so that he could gain some leverage in their fight. He was memorable because of how needlessly cruel he was. I mean, this guy literally allowed Peter to get body slammed by a train. That was just insane to watch. He felt a league above everyone else Peter had fought because he had no filter whatsoever. He manipulated the main character and fought dirty, and his betrayal changed something in the main character. This is something that becomes clear in their final fight. If you compare the first fight between Mysterio and Spider-Man to their final one, you can feel a shift in Peter's attitude and motives. He feels a lot more angrier and more unbalanced. For a brief moment, he lets his emotions take over. He was no longer focusing on simply defeating his enemy or even redeeming them like he had tried with the first one. Instead, his focus was solely on getting the job done. Nothing more and nothing less. You might already know this, but it's after this fight that Peter ends up having his identity revealed by a video that Mysterio fakes, which both frames Peter for his death and also reveals his identity. And do you know which character ends up broadcasting this? It's actually someone that we've seen before. I don't think I've mentioned him too much before, even though he was one of my personal favorites in the original, but it's none other other than J. Jonah himself. The scene was pretty funny to watch in theaters, and it left us all on a perfect cliffhanger while we waited for the next one to be released. It was a great nostalgic callback to the original fans, but whether they knew it or not, his appearance was foreshadowing the film that was eventually released a year later. The final movie in the live-action franchise is my personal favorite, and that's Spider-Man No Way Home. The impact that No Way Home had on fans was something that I can't really compare to anything else. No Way Home goes beyond just being a simple crossover between characters in one universe. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is already made up of a bunch of different crossovers, and after a while, the crossovers sort of lose their initial excitement. This movie, though, brings back the original characters from the past movies, which was kind of a huge deal. Bringing back all of these characters in a way that felt organic and not too forced must not have been an easy task.
Great, it's just some random guy.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's ever really been anything quite like this. At least not with something so popular. There's a reason that there aren't many crossovers between completely separate movie universes. The idea alone sounds like it's incredibly difficult to properly execute. The concept alone breaks the rules of everything. As hard as it must have been to create this movie, they still managed to take this idea and execute it in possibly the best way imaginable. The movie doesn't just bring back old characters for the sake of nostalgia, but the characters play crucial roles in the plot. They make a permanent and canonical mark on the story, and this film is both a continuation of the current Spider-Man as well as the old ones, and audiences loved it. This was something that was brand new to viewers, and seeing all of these characters together at once was something that I'm sure no fan would have ever imagined was possible. The movie begins right where the previous one ended, with the one and only J. Jonah exposing Spider-Man's identity to the entire city. This actually isn't the first time that a Spider-Man has had their identity revealed. If we take things back all the way to the originals, there was a part in the second movie where Peter ends up having his face shown to a small group of people. This isn't because of an accident, by the way, he just takes off his mask mid-fight for some unknown reason. Anyway, this small group of people who get to see his face all end up collectively agreeing to keep Peter's identity a secret so that he can continue to help everyone out. They have all been, to some degree, saved because of him, so it only felt natural for them to return the favor. Peter 3 in the newest films has done the same thing. He's been a part of the Avengers, he's saved the school from danger, he's prevented any serious harm from coming to people around him, so naturally they should also treat him with the same respect, except they don't. The interesting thing about the MCU is that they make an attempt to incorporate superheroes into the real world. They try to make them a natural part of everyone's lives in this world. We can see drawings of heroes in the backgrounds of classrooms. Characters make references to heroes all the time, and they become an essential and regular part of the popular culture in their world. Because of this, people naturally start to lose their pure admiration for them, and they start seeing these heroes as regular people. Their actions start to be called into question, and they start to be more humanized. That's why Peter is treated with a lot of resentment once his identity is revealed. His life and the lives of everyone close to him gets ruined in the process. All of this eventually leads him to go to Doctor Strange, who, for some odd reason, agrees to cast a spell that will cause the entire world to forget his identity. Peter, being Peter, makes too many alterations, and the spell implodes. This is what ends up bringing all the universes together. This Peter is one of the most optimistic and kind-hearted Spider-Man that we've seen. He's always giving others the benefit of the doubt and putting the needs of others before his own. As noble as this is, we've seen that these strengths can get to the point where they become weaknesses. This third movie takes Peter's morality into question. After a few really cool reveals, Peter gets transported back to Doctor Strange's place where he intends on reversing the spell. This would naturally be completely fine. The villains who were pulled in from another universe would get returned to their original ones, and the danger would go with them. However, he realizes that this would mean that they would only be sent back to fulfill their original fates, which is to be killed. This goes against everything that he stands for, and as a last-second resort, he ends up going against Strange so that he can set out to do what no other Spider-Man has done before, which is to work together with the villains in order to fix them. This story could have gone in another more traditional route. They could have just had all the Spider-Men team up against the villains and defeat them, but that would just ruin the perfect and unique opportunity that they had created. People were excited to see these characters after so many years, so to only see them get destroyed in the end would just be a bit of a letdown. What they did instead was that they gave them a chance to redeem themselves. The fight was no longer about stopping them once and for all, it was about giving them a proper chance to change their stories completely. This allowed these characters to play a bigger role in the movie, and it continued their character development that had ended so abruptly in the past. I really loved how all of the original characters felt like they were the same people that many had seen all those years ago. They felt true to their personalities despite how much time had passed. Norman was as compelling and intimidating as ever, and Otto was just as entertaining to watch as he was in the original. Oh, and the lizard is back too. Eventually though, he manages to stop Otto's arms from controlling him, and everything seems to be going well until something sets him off. This scene marks a serious tone shift the second it appears. The movie loses its previous excitement-filled atmosphere, and it almost separates the movie into two different sections. The previous one, which had been more lighthearted, and this one where Peter's life seemingly falls apart completely. The main character had set out to do what was right. He allowed himself to be too trusting once again, and this only resulted in the worst possible outcome. The Green Goblin makes an appearance once again, and destroys everything entirely, killing May in the process. Not only is the scene heartbreaking to watch, but it also has some dramatic irony to it. In the previous versions of of Spider-Man that we've seen, Uncle Ben's death had been caused by Peter's carelessness. A seemingly insignificant act of petty revenge causes his uncle's death, and as a result, Peter ends up learning the importance of his actions and ultimately becomes a better person because of it. He carries the guilt of what he did as a reminder that his every action has the potential to create real differences in people's lives. Whether it be for better or for worse is completely up to him. Here, however, it's the exact opposite. Peter did everything right. He listened to his gut, he defied the people who doubted him, and he gave his all to improve the lives of others. But in the end, it only resulted in destruction. He doesn't learn the importance of his actions from this. He doesn't get to see how his kindness can make a difference, and his mind isn't set on improving the lives of others. Instead, it's set on revenge. If the previous betrayal broke something in him, this final one shattered him. You can feel from this point on how something in Peter changes in a way that can no longer be reversed. He loses that innocence that allowed him to see the best in others, and when we see him again after May's death, it's as if we're looking at a completely different person. He's a shell of who he used to be, and the only reason he's able to temporarily pull himself out of this dark state is because of the support he receives from his friends, and more importantly, from the other Peters. This is when all of the Spider-Men finally meet each other, and it's when he's at his worst that the two of them give him meaningful advice. After all, no one else knows what they're going through exactly except for them. This is especially true for the first one, who went down a similar vengeful path in his final movie. This is why towards the end of their final fight, it's actually the original one that stops the new Peter from killing Norman. He knows more than anyone what it's like to let your emotions take control, so he stopped the newest one from throwing his future away. They went out of their way to make sure that the previous Spider's experiences went into the story, so they didn't simply bring back these iconic characters just for the sake of nostalgia, they made them have a permanent impact on the story. You could feel a real connection between the three of them throughout the movie. There was never any competition or hostility between them. They never tried to prove that one was better than the other, but they were equally as supportive to one another. Their interactions were hilarious and sometimes wholesome, and seeing them together in one room made you see their differences, but it also reminded you that they were all the same. There was no need to compare them or rip their flaws apart, they simply coexisted and made each other better as a result. In fact, it was because of their influences that Peter 3 remains a hero and ends up making an important sacrifice at the end. What made me love the MCU Spider-Man series so much was that it felt so lively. From the main trio who felt like they truly cared about each other, to the reoccurring side characters that added well-timed comedic relief. This series was a part of a bigger universe, so naturally it felt a lot more open, a lot deeper in the sense that you don't feel confined to just this story alone. The audience was able to get to know the large cast of characters, and as a result, we began to grow attached to them. It almost gives this movie a cozy or comforting feeling, knowing that it's a part of a bigger and lively world. By the end, however, this movie is stripped away of all of this. The only way to save not just his universe, but the countless out there, is to have the memory of Peter itself be erased from everyone's mind. His identity would be kept a secret, but at the cost of all of his friends who have become his family to forget ever meeting him. Yet he still chooses to make this impossible decision and willingly allows Strange to go through with it. It's an impossible sacrifice that just feels like a huge slap to the face. The buildup of an entire series that spanned outside of even its own films was erased just like that, and Peter was left completely alone. In the final scene of No Way Home, after coming face to face with the people he once cherished who no longer remembered him, we see Peter in a rundown New York City apartment by himself. His future is unclear, and simply by looking at him, we get the sense that this is not the same Peter that we saw for the very first time all those years ago. He's no longer a dorky kid who was in over his head. He's missing that once lively spark that he once had, and it's clear that it's not something he can ever fully get back. His experiences have changed him, for better or for worse, and he swings out of his apartment one last time, wearing a brand new suit that imitates the ones worn by the other Peters who helped shape him. It's an incredibly bittersweet ending, and I would be lying if I said I wasn't holding back tears when I watched Peter interact with MJ and Ned after they forgot about him. Spider-Man No Way Home wasn't just a unique film that brought us something new, it was a movie that went out of its way to pay proper homage to the ones that came before it. Not just to the previous movies themselves, but to the fans that allowed the series to continue on for so many installations. They created a film that was loved by countless fans, regardless of their differences, and it set the franchise apart in a way that will be remembered fondly for years. The main goal of this video wasn't necessarily to judge all of the movies to see which was better. I never wanted the focus to be on simply pitting them against each other, but to appreciate them for how different they are. A lot of fans often argue over which version of Spider-Man is best, and depending on who you ask, you'll get different answers. Maybe you like the newest version of Spider-Man while others prefer the originals, or maybe you think the version with Pookie Andrew Garfield can't be beat, and hey, I mean, go off, you know, do your thing. Because at the end of the day, there really is no one right answer. And I'm not just saying that to be as neutral as I can, I really do mean it. While I was working on this video, my opinions kept changing about the movies. The one that I considered to be my so-called favorite kept switching back and forth between all three of them until I just sort of stopped trying to compare them and instead appreciated everything that made them unique. I may have an overall favorite at the end of the day, but that doesn't mean that I don't like the rest, and it definitely doesn't mean that the rest are bad movies by comparison. It really just comes down to personal opinion because honestly, all 8 movies are amazing films that should be admired for all the different things that they bring to the table. But I guess now that we're actually nearing the end of the analysis, it wouldn't necessarily be the end of the world if I said which one ended up being my personal favorite. Before I go on, just keep in mind that this is an opinion, so it's probably going to be different from yours, but I guess after looking over all of them, I would have to say that personally, my favorite version of Spider-Man is the one with Miles Morales. Okay, so that might have been kind of a lame reveal, and you might be thinking that I'm only saying that so I can avoid choosing between the main three, and yes, you're absolutely right, but it still holds a lot of truth. Again, I practically knew nothing about the Spider-Man series as a whole, and I never would have even gotten into it if it hadn't been for Into the Spider-Verse. This movie series is, without sounding too dramatic, pretty much the best thing I've ever seen, and they'll continue to be one of my absolute favorite movies. The story and concept was unlike anything I'd ever watched before. It felt refreshing and original. The animation and cinematic shots are some of the most beautiful and unique ones that I've ever seen in an animated movie, and then of course there's the unforgettable cast of characters that you grow to love as the movies go on. Ones that are flawed and broken, but compelling nonetheless. The animation, the music, the characters, the themes, everything about it was crafted to near perfection, and I absolutely loved the main character. I loved how Miles took the idea of having a relatable Spider-Man and ran with it, because technically, Miles was never even meant to be Spider-Man in the first place. Yet he continued to defy all the odds that came his way. Regardless of how much he struggled to rise up to the challenges at first, or how many people doubted him, he established himself as an incredible character. The live-action movies are an amazing set of films that I'll continue to love, but the animated series will always hold a special place in my stinky little heart. Spider-Man is a superhero story that sets itself apart from other stories like it. The main character serves as a reminder that anyone, including ourselves, is capable of achieving greatness. We watch them stumble over and over again, struggle to balance the things that matter most in their lives, but each time they pick themselves up, dust themselves off with a quick joke, and continue forward. No matter which version of Spider-Man you like best, each one has their own reasons to be admired. If you made it this far into the video, I just want to say a quick thank you for listening to me ramble about Spider-Man for so long. I had a really fun time binge watching the entire series from start to finish and seeing what each movie had to offer. And if you're coming back from my very first video and you decided to stick around, thank you so much for deciding to give this channel a chance. I mean, I seriously appreciate it. I really hope you enjoyed this unreliable review and my occasional voice cracks. Stay hydrated, stay cool, and most importantly, stand the best Spider-Man. Miguel O'Hara.